The rain hammered against the windows of Millbrook Elementary with relentless fury, each droplet striking the glass like tiny fists demanding entry. The sound echoed through the empty corridors, bouncing off lockers and bulletin boards covered in crayon drawings of smiling families and alphabet lessons. Lighting flickered outside, casting jagged shadows that danced across the polished linoleum floor before vanishing into darkness again. Marcus Chen adjusted his flashlight beam and checked his watch. 12:47 a.m. The custodial staff had long since finished their evening rounds, leaving him alone in the cavernous building with nothing but the storm for company. As the night security guard for the past 3 years, he'd grown accustomed to the solitude, even found comfort in it. The silence of an empty school held a peculiar peace, broken only by the familiar sounds of settling wood and humming fluorescent lights. He pushed through the double doors leading into the main hallway, his footsteps muffled by the industrial carpet that had seen better days. The children's artwork lined the walls like colorful sentries, their innocent faces watching him pass. Paper turkeys from last month's Thanksgiving project still clung to classroom doors, some beginning to curl at the edges from the humidity that always seemed to permeate the old building. Marcus had walked these halls countless times, knew every squeaky floorboard and loose ceiling tile. Room 103 had a door that didn't quite close properly. The water fountain near the library made a grinding noise when activated. The heater in the east wing clicked on and off, with mechanical precision every 20 minutes. These were the rhythms of his midnight world, predictable and reassuring. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Maybe it was the storm, more violent than the weather forecast had predicted. Or perhaps it was the phone call he'd received from his supervisor earlier that evening, warning him about recent break-ins at schools across the county. Kids looking for electronics to steal, mostly, but the thought of intruders in his domain left him on edge. He rounded the corner toward the kindergarten wing, his flashlight beam sweeping left and right out of habit rather than necessity. The overhead lights worked perfectly fine, but the flashlight made him feel more prepared, more professional. As he approached the intersection where the main hall split toward the cafeteria and the gymnasium, something caught his attention, a sound, barely perceptible above the storm. Footsteps. Marcus stopped, tilting his head to listen more carefully. The rain continued its assault on the building, and somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter banged against the exterior wall. But there it was again, the unmistakable sound of shoes on linoleum, quick and light, like a child running. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. "School's closed. You need to leave immediately." Silence answered him, save for the storm's fury. Marcus felt his pulse quicken slightly. In 3 years of night shifts, he'd encountered exactly 2 intruders, both teenagers who'd broken in on dares. They'd been more frightened than he was, stumbling over apologies and begging him not to call the police. Easy enough to handle. He moved toward the sound, passing the principal's office, with its motivational posters about reading and kindness. The footsteps had seemed to come from the direction of the second-grade classrooms, a section of the building that always felt colder than the rest. The school board blamed it on an aging HVAC system, but Marcus suspected it had more to do with the wing's position on the north side, where the winter winds hit hardest. As he approached room 207, Mrs. Patterson's classroom, he noticed something that made him pause. The door stood slightly ajar, a thin strip of darkness visible between the frame and the wood. Marcus knew for certain that he'd checked this door during his initial rounds at 11 o'clock. Every door in the building had been secure. He placed his hand on the metal handle and pushed the door open slowly. The hinges creaked, a sound he'd never noticed during the day when the halls buzzed with children's voices and teachers' instruction. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of small desks arranged in perfect clusters, each one topped with a name tag, written in careful second-grade handwriting. The room appeared empty, but Marcus stepped inside anyway, playing his light across the reading corner with its collection of worn picture books and the art station, where tomorrow's young Picassos would create masterpieces from construction paper and glue stick. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt profoundly wrong. That's when he noticed the wet footprints. They led from the door to the back of the classroom, small prints that could have belonged to a child of 7 or 8 years old. But these weren't the muddy impressions he might expect from someone who'd come in from the storm. These prints were perfectly clear, as if someone had stepped in clean water and tracked it across the floor. Marcus followed the trail with his flashlight, his breathing shallow and controlled. The prints led to the classroom's back corner, where they simply stopped. No child crouched behind the teacher's desk. No explanation for where the person might have gone. "I know you're in here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Come out now and we can call your parents." No one's in trouble yet. The only response was the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears and the continued drumming of rain against the windows. Marcus swept his flashlight beam across every inch of the classroom, checking behind the bookshelf, under the teacher's desk, even inside the supply closet. Nothing. He was about to leave when he heard it again. Footsteps in the hallway, moving away from the classroom. These weren't the quick, light steps of before. They were slower, more deliberate, accompanied by a strange dragging sound, as if someone were pulling something heavy across the floor. Marcus stepped back into the hallway and looked toward the sound. At the far end of the corridor, barely visible in the emergency lighting, a small figure moved between the shadows, too distant to make out clearly, but definitely human-shaped, child-sized. "Hey," he called, breaking into a run. "Stop right there." The figure disappeared around the corner toward the library. Marcus gave chase, his keys jangling on his belt, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, creating a percussion that seemed to come from all directions at once. When he reached the corner and turned toward the library, the hallway stretched empty before him. The figure had vanished, but the strange dragging sound continued, seeming to come from deeper within the building. Marcus pressed on, passing the computer lab with its rows of outdated machines and the music room where a piano sat silent in the darkness. The dragging sound led him toward the oldest part of the school, a wing that had been built in the 1960s when Millbrook was first constructed. The floors here were different, original hardwood instead of the linoleum installed during renovations. The walls were painted a faded green that had probably been cheerful decades ago, but now looked sickly under the fluorescent lighting. As Marcus approached the end of the hallway, the sound stopped abruptly. He found himself standing before room 145, a classroom that had been vacant all semester. Budget cuts had forced the consolidation of 2 third-grade classes, leaving this room empty except for stacked desks and chairs covered with dust sheets. The door was open. Marcus was absolutely certain this door had been locked during his earlier round. He'd checked it specifically, because empty rooms were favorite hiding spots for kids playing after-hours pranks, yet here it stood, gaping open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. He stepped inside, immediately struck by how much colder this room felt than the rest of the building. His breath didn't quite mist in the air, but he could feel the chill seeping through his uniform. The covered furniture created an obstacle course of white shapes, like ghosts frozen in time. "Whoever you are, this isn't funny anymore," Marcus said, louder than necessary. "I'm calling the police in exactly 30 seconds if you don't show yourself." As if in response, something moved beneath one of the dust sheets, a subtle shifting, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight. Marcus approached cautiously, his free hand moving instinctively to his radio. The movement came again, more pronounced this time, as if someone small were crawling beneath the fabric. With one quick motion, Marcus yanked the sheet away, revealing a cluster of student desks arranged in a circle, empty desks that couldn't possibly have been moving on their own. But the dragging sound resumed immediately, coming from behind him now. He spun around to see another dust sheet sliding slowly across the floor, pulled by invisible hands. As he watched in growing horror, more sheets began to move, creating a choreographed dance of white fabric that surrounded him like living things. Marcus backed toward the door, his flashlight beam darting from one moving sheet to another. His radio crackled to life with static, the sudden noise making him jump. Through the white noise, he thought he heard something else, a voice, young and distant, saying words he couldn't quite make out. He fumbled for the radio's talk button. "Base, this is Marcus at Millbrook Elementary. I need police backup immediately. Possible intruder situation." More static answered him, but beneath it, clearer now, came the sound of children's voices. Not just one voice, but several, all speaking at once in a strange, rhythmic cadence. They seemed to be reciting something, though the words were too distorted by the radio's interference to understand. The dust sheets had stopped moving, but the cold in the room was intensifying. Marcus could see his breath now, small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the still air. The voices on the radio were growing louder, more distinct, and he realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature that they sounded like children reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. But the words were wrong. Instead of liberty and justice for all, they were saying something else, something that made his skin crawl, even though he couldn't quite make it out. Marcus backed out of the classroom and into the hallway, never taking his eyes off the doorway. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the voices stopped, and the radio returned to normal static. The temperature immediately began to feel warmer. He tried the radio again. "Base, do you copy? This is Marcus at Millbrook Elementary." "Marcus, this is dispatch," came the clear, welcome voice of Janet, the overnight dispatcher he'd known for years. "What's your status? I need police backup. Possible break-in. Kids in the building, acting strange. Copy that. Units are en route. Estimated arrival time 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Marcus looked at his watch. 1:23 a.m. He could wait in the main office until the police arrived, or he could continue investigating. Every instinct told him to wait, but something else, professional pride, curiosity, or perhaps just stubborn determination, urged him to keep searching. He decided to compromise. He would check the rest of the old wing quickly, then retreat to the main office to wait for backup. The next classroom, room 43, was locked tight. So was 141. But as he approached room 139, at the very end of the hallway, he could hear something that made his blood run cold. Singing. A child's voice, sweet and clear, singing a lullaby he recognized from his own childhood. "Rock-a-bye baby, in the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock." The voice was coming from inside the locked classroom. Marcus pressed his ear to the door, hardly daring to breathe. The singing continued, note perfect and hauntingly beautiful, but as he listened, he realized there was something off about the melody, something that made his teeth ache, and his vision blur slightly around the edges. "When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all." The voice began to repeat the lullaby, but this time the words changed slightly. "When the bough breaks, the teacher will fall, and down will come children, teacher and all." Marcus stepped back from the door, his hands shaking. He fumbled for his master keyring, knowing he needed to see what was in that room, even though every rational part of his mind screamed at him to run. The key turned easily in the lock, as if it had been recently oiled. The door opened silently, revealing a classroom that looked exactly as it should, except for the small figure sitting in one of the student desks in the front row. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, with long dark hair that hung down to obscure her face. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness, and her feet didn't quite touch the floor as she sat in the child-sized chair. She was still singing, her voice floating through the air like smoke. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, his flashlight trained on the impossible sight before him. The girl's head began to turn slowly toward him, and as it did, her hair fell away from her face, revealing features that were perfectly normal, except for her eye. Where her eyes should have been, There were only dark, empty sockets that seemed to draw in his flashlight beam, like twin black holes. "Hello, Mr. Chen," she said in that same sweet musical voice. "I've been waiting for you." The temperature in the room plummeted so quickly that Marcus's breath came out in thick clouds. Ice began to form on the windows, creating intricate patterns that looked almost like children's drawings. The little girl stood up from her desk with fluid grace, never taking those terrible empty sockets off his face. "You take such good care of our school," she continued, taking a step toward him, walking the halls, checking the doors, keeping us safe. "But you never noticed us before." "We've been here all along, Mr. Chen. We've been watching you." Marcus tried to speak, tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The girl took another step, and as she did, more figures began to emerge from the shadows of the classroom. Children of various ages, all wearing the same white clothing, all with the same hollow, empty eye sockets. "We're your students now," the girl said, her voice joined by the others in a chorus that seemed to come from all around him. "We'll be so good, Mr. Chen. We'll never cause trouble. We'll never leave." The children began to approach him, their movements synchronized like a dance they'd practiced 1,000 times. Marcus found his voice at last, a strangled scream that echoed down the empty hallway. He stumbled backward, slamming the door behind him and turning the key in the lock. But the voices followed him through the door, growing louder and more insistent. "Don't leave us, Mr. Chen. School isn't over yet. We still have so much to learn." Marcus ran. He sprinted down the hallway as fast as his legs would carry him, the children's voices pursuing him like a pack of hungry wolves. Behind him, doors began to slam open, one after another, creating a percussion of sound that mixed with the singing and the storm outside. He reached the main hallway and kept running, passing the familiar landmarks of his nightly rounds, the water fountain, the principal's office, the trophy case, filled with decades of student achievements. But everything looked different now, twisted and wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. The children's voices were getting closer, and when he risked a glance over his shoulder, he saw them pouring out of the old wing like a white river, dozens of them, all with those terrible empty eyes, all singing in perfect harmony. Marcus burst through the front doors of the school and out into the storm. The rain struck him like a physical blow, instantly soaking through his uniform, but he barely noticed. He ran to his patrol car in the parking lot, fumbling for his keys with hands that shook so violently he could barely grip them. The engine started on the first try, and he threw the car into reverse, backing away from the school as fast as he dared on the wet pavement. In his rearview mirror he could see small white figures pressed against the windows of the building, their faces turned toward him like flowers following the sun. His radio crackled to life. "Marcus, this is Unit 47. We're pulling into the parking lot now. Where are you?" Marcus looked around wildly. The parking lot was empty except for his own car, no police vehicles in sight. "Unit 47, I don't see you. Where exactly are you?" "We're right in front of the main entrance, Marcus. Where are you?" But as Marcus looked at the school building, he realized with growing horror that something was wrong. The windows that had been filled with children's faces just moments before were now dark. The front entrance where he'd fled was gone, replaced by solid brick wall. In fact, the entire front of the building looked different. The cheerful blue and yellow color scheme had been replaced by dull gray concrete. The sign that should have read Millbrook Elementary was missing entirely. Marcus got out of his car, slowly, rain immediately soaking him again. He walked toward the building, his flashlight beam playing across unfamiliar architecture. This wasn't his school. This wasn't even a school at all. It was a cemetery, rows of small white headstones stretched out before him where the playground should have been. The building itself was a mausoleum, its architecture exactly matching what he remembered of Millbrook Elementary, but clearly made of stone rather than brick and steel. His radio crackled again. "Marcus, we're not seeing any patrol car in the lot. Are you sure you're at Millbrook Elementary? With trembling hands, Marcus raised the radio to his lips. Dispatch, what's the address for Millbrook Elementary? Marcus, there is no Millbrook Elementary. That school was demolished 15 years ago after the fire. Don't you remember? 28 children and their teacher died. You were one of the investigating officers on that case. The radio fell from his numb fingers, clattering on the wet pavement. Memories began to flood back, not of 3 years as a security guard, but of 15 years as a police detective. The school fire that had haunted his dream, the small bodies carried out in white sheets. The guilt that had driven him to early retirement, to a small cabin in the woods, where he could try to forget. He looked down at his uniform, but it wasn't a security guard's outfit anymore. It was a hospital gown, soaked through with rain and hanging loosely on his thin frame. His hands, when he raised them to his face, were older than he remembered, marked with liver spots and trembling with something more than just cold. Behind him, he heard the sound of car doors slamming and footsteps approaching. Voices called his name, concerned, professional voices that spoke of medication and episodes and how they'd been looking for him all night. But Marcus didn't turn around. He kept staring at the mausoleum that his guilt-ridden mind had transformed into a school where he could somehow protect the children he'd failed to save. 15 years ago, the children who visited him in his dreams every night, asking why he hadn't found them sooner, why he hadn't saved them from the fire that had started in the old wing, in room 39, where faulty wiring had sparked and spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Gentle hands took his arms, guiding him away from the cemetery and toward the warmth of waiting vehicles. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and spoke in soothing tones about getting him back to where he belonged, where he could get the help he needed. As they led him away, Marcus looked back one last time at the mausoleum. In the windows, barely visible through the rain and his tears, small white figures waved goodbye. Their empty eyes seemed filled with forgiveness, and for the first time in 15 years, Marcus Chen felt something like